All right, everyone, it's time to briefly expand upon an idea that I sort of put forth a few days ago and started thinking of, and that's the idea that because the Silicon Valley tech firms, the tech giants, Google, Alphabet technically, Facebook and all these others, Apple, certainly Microsoft, because they are worth so much and have so much power over human communications, it is pragmatic, but it's not just pragmatic, it is now physically essential, it is necessary. Not desirable, but strictly necessary to in some way constrain their power. And I preface this on two things. First and foremost, you have tech firms that are worth more and have more manpower than some countries in this world. That is, a country can't control all communication. There are a bunch of other companies and services that are providing that. The state, honestly, in that sense, has less power than Apple does. The United States, or any other significantly advanced country at this point, has less power over human communication than Google does, than Apple does, than Microsoft or Facebook or Twitter. They control more people's speech on more platforms, and the economic output of these companies is so massive, is so absolutely astronomical that the robber barons of yesteryear, even adjusted for inflation, would not have nearly as much holdings as these people. Some people, by the way, thought that that was an indication that people who run some of the banking cabals in the world are actually less wealthy. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about specifically the Gilded Age, like the 1880s and 90s. I'm talking about yesteryear. I'm talking about over 100 years ago. These people would price fix. They formed trusts. They formed monopolies because the state enabled them to. They were able to do that through the economic and business structure of the time. And then you get the progressive era, which sort of ends that, but then that begins to become a problem too, because, government can be bought off. That's the whole problem. You get corruption. It's like a leaky ship. You plug one hole, another one emerges. It's basically how government tends to operate. The other thing that I would say, beyond simply the mass economic output of this, is that it's the right thing to do because the basis, the philosophical founding of the West and the U.S. in general, these are U.S. firms by and large, most of the biggest companies are. The philosophical basis of freedom is beyond the Constitution. What people who like censorship keep arguing is, well, the Constitution constrains the government. Well, that's not 100% true. It's more complex than that. There are constraints on private enterprise. They do exist, basically that's why you can sue the bakery for not giving you a gay wedding cake. But for some reason, if you get mass depersoned by a coordinated effort cross-platform for otherwise legal behavior, there's no protection for you. I find that astonishing. I find it pragmatically worrying. I think it's necessary to stop that from continuing as soon as possible. What I would say is the philosophical notion of free speech or free expression or a free press goes beyond the constitutional constraint, because you've got to ask yourself, why the Constitution? Why would they care about liberty or something? They could have just set up another monarchy and said, well, we're just going to do the same thing. All we want is representation. They didn't have even a problem with the parliamentary monarchy they were existing under, except they weren't represented and their wishes weren't heard. They could have just said, well, we're going to set up our own monarchy. George Washington, we're electing you king. Here's your scepter and your crown and shit. It's made of wood because we don't have any gold yet because we're, fucking poor. But yeah, you can be king of this tobacco kingdom, basically, of Virginia. And then these other states will be little kingdoms. Or they could have just made one big federated kingdom. And they could have set it up that way. Why didn't they? That's what they were used to. And the concept that there was a right to rule by monarchs as long as they acted legitimately was near and dear to these people. Why then did they break the mold and say, no, we're not going to have that, we're going to have a president. It'll be kind of like a Roman consul in some ways. A limited state, a republic. We're going to have a republic. We're going to be like, play Romans and shit. Why'd they do that? Because they realized that it was pragmatic. They realized that it was necessary for that nation to truly succeed and for people to be able to get ahead, be themselves, and not suffer. They realized that the very presence of those authoritarian power structures were a problem. Now, here's the difficulty. The Constitution does only explicitly affect the federal and state governments and other governing forces in the majority. We now, though, have private enterprises that are as powerful as states are. They're at least as powerful as many states within the United States. Apple is just as powerful as the state of Vermont for all intents and purposes. These companies are so large, they have so many employees, so much of a budget, they are larger than most U.S. states. They're more comparable to something, a larger state, like maybe, Washington State or Florida or something like that. The overall GDP wise, yeah, they're as powerful as fucking. What's the GDP of Texas? Is it comparable to Google or Apple or something? Is it probably about similar, for all I know. I don't know. I'd have to check that. I probably should have done that instead of just looking at the nations. The U.S., of course, the U.S. economy is considerably larger than Silicon Valley, but the states themselves are a component of that. What I would say, though, is that because the spirit and philosophy goes beyond simply, well, we need to prevent the state from abusing people, we should start looking for ways to prevent other groups that have power from abusing people. Quite clearly, if you can be basically depersoned off the entire internet, which is the communication platform of this era, in this technological era, it's the internet and the mobile generation synced right in with it. That's how people communicate. It's often how people make money. It's how they connect with their family and friends the same way. When someone gets depersoned on these platforms, they're also being robbed of interpersonal connections that they might have there too. It's not just about, well, they're making political videos or they're trying to make money. They write books or whatever. No, they have interpersonal connections as well. And business connections that sync up with the real world. They might run a business or something brick and mortar in the real world. And so to expect the economy to be able to deal with the fact that a duopoly in some cases and an oligarchic Silicon Valley system and others should be able to determine who can and cannot undergo commerce, who can and cannot establish like friendships, who can use any of these sites and services and establish themselves, I think is very troublesome. It's techno-tyranny, and I think that we have to put the genie back in the bottle, and the quicker we do it, the less painful it will be. Now, these companies will try to prevent that from happening. They've already donated untold billions to Congress. That's why when these people give congressional testimony, Congress won't let anyone provide a counterpoint. They're not going to have creators come in until they're forced to, until they're compelled to by the vast majority of the people saying, hey, this is wrong. It's out of step with American tradition. These are U.S. firms. It's not pragmatic. It makes no sense. It's the replacement of tyranny of the state with tyranny of corporations. Quite strictly literal fascism in the human communication sense. And there are people who don't have a problem with it until things come home to roost and they're the one that gets inconvenienced. Then all of a sudden it's a problem. So we need to cut the head off the snake. Nobody needs to have that problem and constrain these groups. I would say that requires an Internet Bill of Rights or as a component. The other possibility, someone mentioned this, it's actually a decent idea, and it would be easier than an Internet Bill of Rights or something like that. Expand equal protection legislation nationwide to cover political affiliation and political speech. That's all. That's all you have to do. Then it would be it would be discrimination if these businesses were to refuse to do service to someone and platform them. They're platforms, not publishers, in any properly understood sense, even if they claim otherwise. Facebook, I think, now claims to be a publisher. Big legal mistake, I think. Zuckerberg setting himself up for trillions in lawsuits, but he's a rich dude, and he can buy off judges and prosecutors to try to stave it off. Therein lies the problem. It's hard to pass such a legislation when Congress has been bought up by these people. They might as well. I think that when people go into Congress on those suits that they wear, they should have little stickers that show who donated to them. That's what they should have to do. We can see whose jacket's still clean. That's about all. Peace out.